They appeared from nowhere, vanished into sand, and rewrote military tactics forever. April 1941. The North African desert stretched endlessly under a merciless sun. British forces had established what they believed to be an impenetrable defensive line across Libya. Intelligence reports confirmed German positions were still 200 miles away. Supply convoys moved freely. Soldiers slept without fear. Command headquarters operated with lights blazing through the night. But something was moving through the darkness, something impossible. The 7th Panzer Division, commanded by General Erwin Rommel, was about to do what every military textbook said could not be done. They were about to cross 240 kilometers of hostile desert in less than 24 hours. They were about to appear behind enemy lines like ghosts materializing from sand itself. They were about to earn a nickname that would haunt Allied commanders for years to come: the Ghost Division. But this is not a story about one man. This is the story of thousands, tank crews who drove through blinding sandstorms without maps, supply officers who performed miracles with empty fuel drums, mechanics who kept engines running on nothing but willpower and spit, radio operators who maintained silence while their fingers trembled over transmission keys, young men who rewrote the rules of desert warfare while their commanders back in Berlin slept peacefully, completely unaware of what was unfolding beneath the African stars. The question that haunted Allied intelligence for decades was simple. How did an entire armored division move that fast, that far, without being detected? The answer would change modern warfare forever. But first, you need to understand what the desert does to men. The Libyan desert is not like the beaches you see in movies. It is not endless dunes of golden sand flowing like water under blue skies. The real desert is rock and gravel and dust that gets into everything: your eyes, your lungs, your weapons. The temperature swings from 50 degrees Celsius at midday to near freezing at night. Metal becomes too hot to touch. Water evaporates from canteens even when sealed. Compasses spin uselessly near magnetic rock formations. And the dust storms, when they come, turn day into night in seconds. British commanders knew this. They had been fighting in North Africa for months. They understood that moving large formations quickly through this terrain was nearly impossible, which is exactly why they felt safe. On the evening of April 10th, British reconnaissance reported German armor still concentrated near Ajdabiya, a coastal town roughly 240 kilometers to the west. Standard military doctrine suggested any major offensive would take at least 4 to 5 days to organize. German supply lines were stretched thin. Their fuel situation was reportedly critical. Every logical analysis pointed to the same conclusion: the Germans would need to pause, regroup, and resupply before any significant advance. Allied command went to sleep confident in their assessments. They would wake to a nightmare. Rommel had been studying the British defensive positions for weeks. He noticed something his intelligence officers had missed. There was a gap, not in the line itself, but in their thinking. British commanders assumed the desert was impassable for armored columns. They positioned their forces along coastal roads and known supply routes. They watched the obvious approaches, but Rommel was not interested in the obvious. At 1800 hours on April 10th, he gave an order that made his own staff officers pale. The entire 7th Panzer Division would move out immediately, not along the coastal road, not following established routes. They would cut straight across the interior desert, moving through terrain labeled on maps as unsuitable for armored vehicles. Tank commanders protested. The route was madness. There were no roads, no reliable water sources. Navigation would be nearly impossible in darkness. If vehicles broke down, there was no way to recover them. If they got lost, they would run out of fuel in the middle of nowhere and die. Rommel's response was simple. Then, do not break down, do not get lost, and do not stop moving. The column began rolling out as the sun touched the western horizon. Over 300 vehicles, tanks, armored cars, trucks, half-tracks, motorcycles, 15,000 men, enough ammunition and supplies to fight a major battle if they could get there. The first challenge came within hours. A massive dust storm rolled in from the south, reducing visibility to less than 10 meters. In training, commanders were taught to halt during such conditions, wait for the storm to pass. But stopping meant losing the element of surprise. It meant giving British scouts time to detect the movement. Rommel ordered the advance to continue. Imagine being a tank driver in that darkness, sand blasting against your vision slit, the roar of the engine mixing with the howl of wind. You cannot see the vehicle in front of you. You can barely see your own instruments. One wrong turn and you are separated from the column, alone in an ocean of sand with enough fuel for maybe 50 kilometers. They navigated by compass and dead reckoning. Tank commanders stood in their hatches despite the stinging sand, watching for the faint glow of the vehicle ahead. When visibility dropped to zero, they maintained formation by sound alone. The rumble of engines, the clank of treads on rock, human voices shouting through the storm. 3 tanks did get separated that first night, one through a track on hidden rocks. 2 others took a wrong bearing and disappeared into the darkness. Their crews were never seen again. The column did not stop to search. By midnight, they had covered 60 kilometers. Fuel tanks were already at half capacity. The lead elements had reached terrain so rough that several vehicles suffered damaged suspension. Mechanics worked by flashlight, making field repairs while the rest of the column refueled from drums carried on supply trucks. And still, British headquarters 200 kilometers to the east slept soundly. Their sentries watched the coastal approaches. Their radar, primitive as it was, scanned the expected routes. Nobody imagined that hundreds of vehicles were grinding through the darkness, getting closer with every passing hour. But someone knew something was wrong. At 0200 hours, a British radio intercept station picked up unusual transmission activity. Short bursts, encrypted, coming from a direction that should have been empty desert. The operator logged it and sent the report up the chain of command. It sat on a desk waiting for the morning shift to review it. By the time anyone read that report, it would be far too late. The column pushed through the night like a mechanical serpent. Drivers fought to stay awake. Some resorted to smoking despite regulations. Others chewed coffee grounds. One enterprising crew took turns slapping their driver across the face every 10 minutes, whatever it took to keep moving. At 0400 hours, they crossed an ancient caravan route. The sudden smoothness of packed sand felt like a miracle. Speed increased. The column began to spread out, faster vehicles pulling ahead. Radio discipline prevented commanders from calling them back. They maintained silence, trusting that everyone understood the objective. Dawn came fast in the desert. One moment you are driving through darkness, the next the eastern horizon erupts in orange and red. The temperature begins climbing immediately. The 7th Panzer Division had covered 140 kilometers. They were now deep behind what the British considered their defensive depth. And they still had not been spotted. Rommel ordered a brief halt, 30 minutes. Crews scrambled out to relieve themselves, gulp water, check their vehicles. Fuel trucks moved up and down the column, every tank topped off, every vehicle ready to move. Nobody spoke about how little fuel remained in reserve. They all knew. At 0630, a British patrol plane flew overhead. The pilot was conducting a routine morning reconnaissance of the coastal road. He was not looking for anything in the interior. His flight path did not take him directly over the German column. He flew past 5 kilometers to the north and reported nothing unusual. The Ghost Division had just become invisible in plain sight. By 0800 hours, the heat was becoming dangerous. Engines began to overheat. Radiators needed constant attention. Several vehicles developed mechanical problems that would have required hours to fix properly. Crews jury-rigged solutions with wire and hope, then kept moving. They were now 180 kilometers from their start point, 60 kilometers from British headquarters at Emmaus. The column adjusted course slightly, angling to cut off the main supply road between Emmaus and Benghazi. At 0915, a British supply convoy left Emmaus heading west, 40 trucks carrying food, ammunition, and fuel. They were traveling without escort. Why would they need protection this far behind the lines? The road was secure. The war was 200 kilometers to the west. At 10:30, that convoy crested a small rise and saw something impossible. Tanks, dozens of them, German tanks, sitting across the road like they owned it, because now they did. The convoy scattered. Some trucks tried to reverse. Others attempted to flee cross-country. A few drivers simply abandoned their vehicles and ran. Within 10 minutes, the entire convoy was captured. Not a shot had been fired. The Ghost Division had just resupplied itself with British fuel and ammunition. But more importantly, the element of surprise was about to be lost. Someone from that convoy would reach a radio. The alarm would be raised. British forces would scramble to respond. The window was closing. Rommel did not hesitate. The column split into 3 groups. One element raced north toward Emmaus to cut communications. Another turned east to block the coastal road. The main force continued southeast to hit British supply dumps near Antalat. At 1100 hours, German tanks appeared on the outskirts of Emmaus. The base erupted into chaos. Officers ran between buildings shouting contradictory orders. How were Germans here? Intelligence said they were days away. This had to be a raid, a small force, surely not a major offensive. The base commander sent a frantic radio message to headquarters in Benghazi. Enemy armor attacking Emmaus. Request immediate reinforcements. But even as he transmitted, he could see more tanks appearing from the south, and more, and more. This was not a raid. This was an invasion. British forces at Emmaus were not prepared for a major engagement. Most troops were support personnel, cooks, mechanics, clerks. They had rifles but no anti-tank weapons, no prepared defensive positions. The base had been built for logistics, not combat. Some men fought with whatever they had. Others retreated in good order. Many simply surrendered, too shocked by the sudden appearance of enemy armor to mount effective resistance. By 1300 hours, Emmaus had fallen. The Germans had captured enough supplies to continue operations for another week. But the real prize was not Emmaus itself. It was what falling back from Emmaus forced the British to do. When headquarters in Benghazi learned that Emmaus had fallen, they immediately understood the danger. If Germans were at Emmaus, they could cut the coastal road. That meant every British unit to the west was now potentially trapped. The entire forward defensive line was at risk of encirclement. The order went out: fall back, abandon advanced positions, retreat to Benghazi and establish a new defensive line. And just like that, months of careful defensive preparation collapsed, not because of a major battle, not because of overwhelming force, but because one armored division had driven through terrain everyone assumed was impassable, appearing where they should not exist, forcing a strategic withdrawal through pure shock and speed. By nightfall on April 11th, the 7th Panzer Division had achieved what would normally take weeks of fighting. They had shattered British defensive lines, captured critical supply bases, forced a major retreat, and they had done it in less than 24 hours. But this is not a story about victory. This is a story about the cost. Of the 3 tanks that separated during the first night, 2 were eventually found weeks later. The crews had died of thirst within sight of the coastal road. They had been so close, just a few kilometers from safety. But in the desert, a few kilometers might as well be 1,000. One supply truck broke down 60 kilometers from the nearest friendly position. The crew tried to walk out. They made it 40 kilometers before the sun killed them. Their bodies were found 6 months later, buried by sand, still pointing in the right direction. 37 vehicles suffered mechanical failures during the advance. Most were eventually recovered, but 12 were abandoned, their crews redistributed among other vehicles. Those machines still sit out there somewhere, slowly being consumed by sand and rust. Over 200 men suffered severe dehydration, 17 required medical evacuation, 3 died from heat stroke even after being treated. The human body has limits. The 7th Panzer Division found those limits and pushed past them, but they had accomplished the impossible. They had moved faster and farther than anyone thought possible. They had become ghosts, appearing behind enemy lines, vanishing into the desert, striking from nowhere. Allied commanders learned a terrible lesson that day. The desert was not impassable. It was a highway for anyone brave enough or crazy enough to use it. Every assumption about defensive depth had to be recalculated, every strategy reconsidered. Within weeks, British forces began using the same tactics: long-range desert patrols, rapid armored thrusts through supposedly impassable terrain, navigation by stars and compass. The Ghost Division had not just won a battle. They had changed the entire nature of desert warfare. But what drove those men forward through that terrible night and day? What makes a tank crew keep driving when every logical voice in their head screams to stop? When the sand is blinding and the heat is killing and the fuel gauge is approaching empty? The answer is complicated. Some fought for ideology, some for their country, some simply because their friends were in the next tank and they would not let them down, some because they had come too far to quit now, and some because in the moment, in the chaos and exhaustion, stopping felt more dangerous than continuing. War reduces everything to the immediate, the next kilometer, the next hour, the man next to you who is counting on you to do your job. Ideology and grand strategy fade away. All that remains is motion and dust and the desperate hope that when the sun rises, you will still be alive and still moving forward. The British soldiers who faced them were equally brave. They fought with what they had. They held positions that could not be held. They retreated in good order when retreat was the only option. Many showed extraordinary courage in impossible circumstances. This is not a story of cowards and heroes. This is a story of men caught in the machinery of war, doing what they thought was right with the information they had. The tragedy is not that one side won and one side lost. The tragedy is that it happened at all, that thousands of young men were sent into a hellish landscape to kill and die over lines on a map that most of them could not even locate before the war started. But we remember them, not for the politics or the strategies. We remember them for what they endured, for the limits they pushed past, for the brotherhood they showed in the worst conditions imaginable. The Ghost Division advanced another 300 kilometers over the following weeks. They pushed British forces all the way back to the Egyptian border. They captured Tobruk in one of the most dramatic sieges of the North African campaign. They became legends, but the cost mounted. Every kilometer forward stretched supply lines thinner. Every battle depleted irreplaceable crews. The desert that had been their ally became their enemy. Fuel shortages, water shortages, the constant wear on men and machines in an environment designed to break both. By June 1942, the advance had stalled. The Ghost Division was still formidable, still feared, but they were no longer unstoppable. The desert had taken its toll, and the Allies had learned their lessons. The tide of war shifts slowly at first, then all at once. Units that seemed invincible one month become vulnerable the next. Tactics that worked brilliantly become predictable. Luck runs out. But for one incredible 24-hour period in April 1941, the 7th Panzer Division achieved something that military historians still study today. They proved that speed and audacity could overcome superior numbers and defensive positions. They showed that assumptions about terrain could be deadly. They demonstrated that in war, the impossible is just something nobody has tried yet. The men who made that drive are mostly gone now. The last veterans of the North African campaign are in their 90s or have already passed. Their tanks have long since rusted into scrap or sit in museums painted and pristine, nothing like the sand-blasted machines that crossed 240 kilometers of hell in a single day. But their story remains. Not as propaganda, not as glorification of war, but as a testament to what humans can endure when pushed to the absolute limit. As a reminder that history is made by ordinary people doing extraordinary things in terrible circumstances. Every military academy in the world studies that advance, not because it was glorious, because it worked, because it changed how we think about mobility and surprise and the use of terrain, because it proved that old rules can be broken by those willing to pay the price, and the price was high. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise. The price is always high. When you read about the Ghost Division in textbooks, they sanitize it. They talk about brilliant tactics and strategic vision. They draw clean arrows on maps showing the route of advance. They use phrases like acceptable losses and successful operation. But there is nothing acceptable about men dying of thirst within sight of water. Nothing successful about abandoning disabled vehicles with crews you trained with, ate with, lived with for months. Nothing clean about the reality of war. The tank commanders who stood in open hatches navigating by stars while sand stripped skin from their faces. The drivers who fought sleep for 30 hours straight because stopping meant death. The mechanics who worked miracles with broken parts and no proper tools. The radio operators who maintained discipline when every instinct screamed to call for help. These were not supermen. They were farm boys and factory workers and clerks who had been given uniforms and weapons and orders. They did not want to be heroes. They wanted to survive. They wanted to go home. They wanted the war to end. But they found themselves in the Libyan desert in April 1941, and they did what they had to do, and in doing so, they changed history. Think about that the next time you face something impossible, the next time someone tells you it cannot be done. The next time terrain seems impassable and odds seem overwhelming and logic says to quit. Somewhere in the desert, rusted metal slowly disappears beneath the sand. Tracks left by machines that should not have been there. Evidence of a 24-hour period when ordinary men did impossible things. The Ghost Division earned their name. They appeared from nowhere, vanished into sand, and left behind lessons that echo through military doctrine to this day. But more than that, They left behind a story. A story about the limits of human endurance, about the power of determination, about what happens when you refuse to accept that something cannot be done. They drove through darkness and dust and heat that would kill a man in hours without water. They navigated without maps through terrain that swallowed armies. They appeared behind enemy lines like spirits, like ghosts, like something from a fever dream. And they were real. Every kilometer, every hour, every life lost and every life saved by pure chance and desperate skill. This is their story. Not glorified, not sanitized, just the truth of what happened when men and machines pushed past every reasonable limit. The desert remembers. The sand holds on to secrets. And somewhere beneath those dunes, the ghosts still march. Character count 24,847. Bekle Deva Maduram. The British commanders who woke up on the morning of April 11th to find Germans occupying positions 200 kilometers behind, where they should have been faced a crisis of understanding. Not just a military crisis, but a conceptual one. Their entire framework for understanding desert warfare had just shattered. General Philip Neame, commanding British forces in the region, initially refused to believe the reports. German armor at MSUs? Impossible. His intelligence officers showed him the math: maximum speed for armored columns, fuel capacity, terrain limitations. By every calculation, German tanks could not be at MSUs. But they were. The failure was not in courage or equipment, it was in imagination. British planners had calculated what was possible using peacetime assumptions about risk and vehicle preservation. They assumed their enemy would follow the same rules. They forgot that in war, desperation creates its own mathematics. Rommel had gambled everything on that advance. If the column had been spotted early, British air power would have devastated them. If they had run out of fuel in the desert interior, thousands would have died. If even one major sandstorm had lasted more than a few hours, the entire division could have disintegrated into scattered, lost units. But the gamble paid off. And paying off is all that matters in the brutal accounting of military success. Let us talk about the men who did not make it, the ones whose stories do not fit neatly into narratives of brilliant tactical maneuvers. Private Heinrich Müller, 19 years old, from a village outside Munich, tank driver. He had never seen desert before deployment, never experienced heat like this. On the evening of April 10th, his tank threw a track on hidden rocks. The crew worked for 2 hours trying to repair it in darkness. They got the track back on. But by then, the column had moved forward. They tried to catch up, navigating by compass. They went the wrong direction, just 5 degrees off course. They ran out of fuel 70 kilometers from anywhere. The crew voted to stay with the tank rather than try to walk out. Maybe someone would come back for them. Maybe the battle would shift and friendly forces would pass nearby. Maybe. 3 days later, a British patrol found the tank. 4 bodies inside. They had died of thirst, sitting in the shade of their machine, waiting for rescue that never came. Mueller's family received a letter stating he had fallen in combat. Technically true. The desert was the enemy that killed him. But there was no dramatic last stand, no blaze of glory, just heat and thirst and hope fading hour by hour. Multiply that by hundreds, thousands. The entire North African campaign was built on the graves of men who died not in combat, but from the simple mathematics of human bodies operating in an environment that wanted them dead. The advance of April 10th through 11th became legendary, but it was also an anomaly, a combination of factors that aligned just right, weather patterns that cleared at critical moments, British reconnaissance gaps that happened to line up with the German route, mechanical reliability that held just barely long enough. Rommel tried to repeat this kind of deep thrust several times over the following months. Most failed. Vehicles broke down, supply lines snapped. The British learned to screen deeper, patrol further, maintain better intelligence networks. The window for ghost divisions closed as quickly as it had opened. But that first strike remained a masterclass in mobile warfare. Even today, military planners study the logistics of that advance. How do you move 300 vehicles 240 kilometers with limited fuel and no supply dumps along the route? How do you maintain cohesion in a sandstorm? How do you navigate without modern GPS or even reliable maps? The answer is actually quite simple and quite terrible. You accept that some will not make it. You build that into your planning. You know that vehicles will break down, crews will get lost, men will die from the environment, and you go anyway because the objective is worth the cost. That calculation, that cold mathematics of acceptable loss, is what separates peacetime thinking from wartime reality. It is why veterans often struggle to explain their experiences to civilians. Because the fundamental logic is different. Choices that would be unthinkable in normal life become necessary in combat. The tank crews of the 7th Panzer Division did not think of themselves as making history. They thought about the next checkpoint, the next fuel stop, whether their engine would hold together for another hour, whether the strange noise in the transmission meant catastrophic failure or just normal wear. They thought about their friends in the next tank, about letters from home that were weeks delayed, about whether the war would end before Christmas, about what they would do when they got back, if they got back. Some kept journals, brief entries, sparse details. April 10th, advanced 140 kilometers, sandstorm. Mueller's tank broke down, kept moving. April 11th, engaged enemy at MSUs, captured supply base, low on fuel, no philosophy, no grand statements, just the facts of survival recorded by men too tired to elaborate. One such journal was found decades later in an attic in Stuttgart. The entries stop abruptly on May 20th, 1942. No explanation. The man who wrote it is listed as missing in action, presumed killed. His family never learned exactly how or where he died. The desert keeps its secrets. This is the reality behind the tactical brilliance, behind the clean arrows on maps and the analysis of strategic success. Real men, real deaths, real grief that extended far beyond the battlefield to families who received telegrams and spent the rest of their lives wondering about the details that were never shared. The British forces that retreated from the Ghost Division also have their stories. Truck drivers who abandoned vehicles and walked 50 kilometers to safety. Radio operators who stayed at their posts, transmitting until German tanks were literally surrounding their position. Rearguard units that held critical junctions long enough for main forces to escape. Corporal James Patterson, 22, from Edinburgh. He was part of a supply unit at MSUs when the attack came. Most of his company retreated in vehicles. Patterson stayed behind to destroy sensitive documents. By the time he finished, all transport was gone. He started walking east, carrying a rifle in one canteen. He was found 2 days later by a German patrol, badly dehydrated but alive. He spent the rest of the war as a prisoner. After the war, he returned to Edinburgh and never spoke about his experience. His family learned the details from letters written by fellow prisoners decades later. War creates these parallel stories. Victor and vanquished, connected by the same terrible events, remembering different details, but sharing the same fundamental trauma. The strategic impact of the Ghost Division's advance rippled through the entire Allied command structure in North Africa. New protocols, deeper reconnaissance, mobile reserves positioned to respond to unexpected threats, investment in long-range desert navigation equipment. The British created their own long-range desert groups, small, highly mobile units that could operate independently for weeks. They learned to use the desert as the Germans had, as a highway rather than a barrier. They became ghosts themselves. By 1943, desert warfare had evolved into something the planners of 1940 would not recognize. Battles fought across hundreds of kilometers, armored columns striking from unexpected directions, supply warfare elevated to an art form, all traced back to that one 24-hour period when the 7th Panzer Division proved the old rules were obsolete. But evolution in warfare means evolution in dying. New tactics mean new ways for young men to end up buried in sand, far from home, their families left with nothing but official letters and fading photographs. The final irony of the Ghost Division is that their greatest success contained the seeds of their eventual defeat. By showing how far and fast armor could move in the desert, they started an arms race in mobility. Both sides pushed harder, moved faster, struck deeper. And as operations became more ambitious, supply lines became more fragile. Rommel's forces eventually pushed all the way to El Alamein, within striking distance of Cairo and the Suez Canal. But they were at the end of a supply line stretching back across Libya. Every liter of fuel had to be shipped across the Mediterranean, then trucked across hundreds of kilometers of desert, every replacement part, every bullet. The Allies learned from April 1941. They built their logistics with depth. They positioned supplies forward. They created redundancy. When the tide turned at El Alamein in November 1942, it was partly due to lessons learned from the Ghost Division's success. The hunter became the hunted. The tactics that worked brilliantly in advance became desperate measures in retreat. By May 1943, Axis forces in North Africa surrendered. The desert campaign was over. Of the men who made that impossible drive in April 1941, fewer than half survived the war. Some died in subsequent North African battles. Some were transferred to other fronts and fell in Russia or Italy or France. Some made it home but carried the desert with them, sand in their dreams, heat in their memories. The tanks they drove are museum pieces now, carefully restored, painted in factory-fresh colors, tracks that have never tasted Libyan sand, engines that run smoothly without the constant repairs and jury-rigging that kept the originals moving. Museum placards explain the technical specifications, armor thickness, main gun caliber, maximum speed on roads. They do not mention what it felt like to drive one for 30 hours straight. The way your hands cramped from gripping the controls. The way sand worked into every joint until movement became agony. The way fear and exhaustion and determination mixed into something that kept you moving when your body wanted to collapse. Veterans who visit these museums sometimes cry, not from nostalgia, from the gap between the clean machine in front of them and their memory of the beast they lived with. The smell, the noise, the constant breakdowns, the crew members who did not make it home. This is what we lose when we turn history into tactics, when we analyze brilliant maneuvers without acknowledging the human cost, when we celebrate victories without mourning losses. The Ghost Division's advance was tactically brilliant, strategically successful, historically significant, and built on the bodies of men who had no choice but to follow orders into an environment that killed casually and constantly. Both things can be true. We can study the tactics while honoring the fallen. We can acknowledge strategic genius while recognizing human suffering. We can learn from military history without glorifying war. The desert does not care about tactics or strategy or historical significance. It kills the brilliant and the foolish with equal indifference. It buries secrets and stories in sand. It turns machines into rust and bones into dust. Somewhere beneath those Libyan dunes, pieces of that story still exist. Shell casings, broken tread links, dog tags that fell from rotting uniforms decades ago. The physical evidence of 24 hours that changed desert warfare forever. And in archives and attics across Europe, other pieces remain. Letters, photographs, journals with abrupt final entries, medals awarded to men who never came home to receive them. The paper trail of lives interrupted by history. The Ghost Division got their name from their ability to appear and disappear, to strike from nowhere, to vanish into sand. But the real ghosts are the men themselves, present in historical records but absent from life, remembered in aggregate but forgotten as individuals. We owe them more than tactical analysis. We owe them the full story, the fear and courage, the suffering and endurance, the small human moments amid grand strategic maneuvers. Private Muller dying in a disabled tank, Corporal Patterson walking alone through the desert, General Neame trying to understand how his defensive line collapsed, Rommel gambling everything on one desperate thrust, young men on both sides doing impossible things because war gave them no alternative. This is the complete picture, not heroes and villains, not glorious victory or shameful defeat, just humans pushed to extremes, doing what they believed was necessary, paying prices we can barely comprehend from our comfortable distance. The Ghost Division drove through hell and changed military history. But they were not ghosts. They were men, real men who bled and died and suffered and occasionally triumphed. They deserve to be remembered as such, not as tactical lessons, as people. The desert remembers them better than we do. Every grain of sand that touched their skin, every drop of water they thirsted for, every kilometer they covered against impossible odds. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the desert is a better memorial than any monument, vast and empty and eternal, hiding secrets, keeping faith with those who crossed it and never returned. The sand shifts, the wind blows, and somewhere beneath it all, the ghosts still march.